Raphael.
How are you?
Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment.
Hello, hello.
Just letting more folks in from the waiting room. We'll be getting started in just a moment here. Good afternoon and welcome to Aurora Connects Season 4, Episode 1, Porch Stories, a conversation about urban change. I'm Aurora Theater Associate Artistic Director, Dawn Monique Williams, and as always, I'm joined by Artistic Director Josh Costello. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Dawn, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you. How's it going out there to Writers Retreat?
Good. It's been really lovely. It's been really lovely. Jonathan Spector and I are working on a play we'll be doing at Aurora in a few months.
Well, that's so lovely that you got that time away to work on the play. We've been hard at work here, not in the office, but here on the West Coast, preparing for this episode. We are live here in a Zoom room, joined by several people, and we are also streaming out. So hopefully folks can experience the quality stream. There is a little technical stuff happening, but I'm trying to stay on top of it. As always, please feel free. Drop questions in the chat. If you're in the Zoom in the chat, if you're watching YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch, please, I'm watching all the chat streams and we'd be happy to have you participate in the conversation with us. I would be remiss if I didn't make the connection that we've curated this conversation about storytelling and place-based storytelling to coincide with our production of Stoop Stories by Dael Orlandersmith, which we will start streaming on September 3rd. We will do a week of previews with our official opening on the 9th, September 9th. Am I making that up, Josh? September 9th?
That sounds right. Let's go with that.
And we will also have a series of ongoing conversations via Zoom. Those won't stream out, but you can join us via Zoom. And those conversations are on September 19th, September 25th, and October 1st. Those will be in lieu of what would have traditionally been our post-show conversations. So the joy is you can come before you've seen it, after you've seen it. You could come to all three. They'll be curated a little bit differently, but we definitely want to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, and Stoop Stories is just the first show of our 30th anniversary season at Aurora Theatre Company. We have 5 really wonderful plays. We are hopeful that 4 of them will be live and in person. We'll see. We'll stream them to you on video if need be. But we're really excited about this season. You can read all about it at auroratheater.org. And while you're there, if you are so moved, you can click the donate button on the top right and help us get through this very, very difficult time. We really appreciate our audience, our subscribers, everybody who comes through our doors and part of this wonderful community. So thank you all.
And now I would love to bring to the virtual stage Future Histories Lab Creative Director and our community partner on this immersive conversation and Stoop Stories, Susan Moffat.
Hello.
Hi,
Hi,
Susan.
everybody. It's great to be here.
There you
So
are.
I am so excited to be working with theater folks. I'm going to just introduce a little bit about Future Histories Lab, which is an interdisciplinary program at UC Berkeley that brings together faculty, students, and community members to tell stories that need to be told in order to imagine better futures. Dawn, are you going to be introducing everybody? Do you want me to give any more info at this point, or?
Oh, if you want to, or I can do it as we welcome them to the stage. Either way, Susan.
Please do. Go for it.
Okay, well, first we're gonna welcome Karen Chapple, Dr. Karen Chapple, who has been doing a lot of work on the displacement project, was a faculty at UC Berkeley, and is now leaving the area to take up a position at University of Toronto. Am I saying that right? I hope I'm not messing that up, Karen, but welcome, Karen.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. So I'm just really thrilled to be here today. Really honored to have the invitation and the privilege of being with my co-panelists. So I'm here to talk from the perspective of the Urban Displacement Project. And I just, here in this slide, I call out some of the marvelous grad students who helped me with this presentation that I'll be showing you in a moment. When Susan and Dawn first asked me to join this discussion, I thought, Stoop stories, even if we call it porch stories, there's something fundamentally different about the East Bay, about Oakland and Berkeley in particular, from New York, where Stoop Stories is set. So then I sat down and I read the play, and it's really great, and you should go see it. But it's actually not really about stoops. It's about stories of love and humanity and neighborhoods. And of course, these are themes that play out everywhere in the world, including right here in the East Bay. The play is also about the deep understanding of place that comes from rootedness. And in urban places, rootedness is beautifully embodied by the stoop, by the idea of the stoop. Stoop is a Dutch word for step, and it's strongly associated with urban places, and it's used in many cities around the world, including New York, obviously, places that welcome a constant stream of old timers and newcomers. But this is a story that plays out a little differently when you bring it to the East Bay, which is the home of the Aurora Theatre. And I would argue that it's part we have to see this differently because of the deep anti-urban sentiment. And this itself comes out of white supremacy and then gets baked into the very fabric of cities, especially Berkeley, but also Oakland, through layers and layers of policies and plans and zones and regulations, and even the very practices, the day-to-day practices of the real estate industry. So Berkeley had a choice as it was developing. This is Berkeley in 1908, and you can see it had a lot of room to grow. But instead, in 1916, it became the birthplace of exclusionary zoning. This was in part due to its reliance on racial covenants from an early era, and also due to the active intervention of real estate company Mason McDuffie, which sought to preserve real estate values by avoiding the evils of uncontrollable development, as it says here. When residential segregation was deemed unconstitutional, developers and wealthy residents and city officials still had two tools to keep segregation in place. Those were racial covenants, still legal, and zoning. So racial covenants were banned. Back here. Racial covenants were banned in 1948, but then redlining comes along. And this makes it hard to get loans in areas that are designated as risky. Then in the 1970s, and this is still in Berkeley, the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance reinforces exclusion again by banning apartment construction in many areas. And this all reinforces the zoning of today. And this is today's zoning map in Berkeley, which has essentially frozen those historic boundaries in time, even though they entrench systemic racism in Berkeley. At the Urban Displacement Project, we looked at what areas were gentrifying in Berkeley, and those were the neighborhoods here in purple. And then we looked at what neighborhoods were excluding low-income residents or pushing them out. And we found, lo and behold, in the map on the right, that neighborhood change today is still following the same lines from 100 years ago, reinforcing the inequity. So we have gentrification in the flats, which were redlined, and we have exclusion in the north and in the hills, where you could get loans easily. What does this mean in terms of people? And here I'm going to wrap up. You can see here, this is a chart of South Berkeley around the Ashby BART station. You can see the population change beginning in 1940. The Black population peaked in 1970 at about 70%, and the white population took over starting in 2000. The Black population today is down to 20%. So why is this? That's because this is the only part of the city left that's affordable. So this is where people come, and this is where the new white population has been settling. So Mason McDuffie, the real estate company 100 years ago, succeeded. It kept those areas in the hills exclusive. So that's why, at least in Berkeley today, stoop stories are a little bit harder to come by. So I'm going to stop there and hear about the stories that we do have.
So now we're going to jump in and ask June and CJ and Dave to join us and turn on your videos so we can see you. There we go. I just want to give a warm welcome to CJ, who is CEO of the Black Cultural Zone Community Development Corporation in East Oakland, and Dave Peters, representing West Oakland and founder of the Black Liberation Walking Tour, and June Grant, who's an architect who has worked all over the world, but also in Oakland. And we're going to transition from kind of the big picture view that Karen has given to the individual stories that kind of bring to life the patterns that she's described, and patterns that are were already really well known in the neighborhoods, but that I think only recently have become more widely known as we're seeing those redlining maps more represented in the media, and it's just been so much more a part of conversation in the last couple of years. But back to the porches and stoops. I ask each of our speakers to talk about how and where knowledge was passed down where you grew up. And I'm just going to start with June, because June, as an architect, has thought a lot about these transitional spaces like porches and stoops and other kind of in-between spaces that are public and private. And June, when you were growing up in your neighborhood, where did storytelling happen? Where did knowledge of place get passed down, and how did that affect your thinking about design?
First, I want to point out that I'm not originally from the US. I'm Jamaican. And for me, where I grew up, knowledge was transferred primarily in the kitchen. I grew up with my 3 generations in the house, and we're mainly women. And so for me, as far as I remember, my grandmother being daycare, it was in the kitchen and the backyard, where she planted tomatoes. And it was in the act of making food and planting food that knowledge was transferred. So for my family, at least as a young kid, it was not the porch. The porch, or in Jamaica, we don't call it the porch, it's the veranda. On the veranda is where gossip occurred. And it's where not everyone was allowed to sit on the veranda. And not everyone in the neighborhood was allowed in your yard. So it wasn't a neighborhood dynamic. It was more about, if you came to visit our house, you first had to knock on the gate, then we had to acknowledge you, then we had to invite you to come to the porch. And if you were known well enough, you were invited to sit on the porch. And you could tell how much respect the family had for you if we offered you a glass of water or something to drink. So these are not spaces of just separating private from public, or as a space to just hang out and share knowledge. There's a whole body politic around that front 10 feet that separates your front door from the rest of the world. And even the distance between the gate and the front door has politics surrounding it. So it's not such a simple answer as we sat on the front and that's where, we traded knowledge. In my family, it was more in the kitchen that we shared knowledge.
Yeah.
That was growing up.
Yeah. Dave, how about you? When you took us on the Black Liberation walking tour in West Oakland, it really struck me. You took us down the street where you grew up and pointed out the house of C.L. Dellums, the great labor leader and uncle of Ron Dellums, former mayor and congressperson. And you told all kinds of stories about that house and everything else that happened on that street. Where did you learn those stories?
First, I'm really honored to be part of this panel. I'm really excited to be here. I'll lead into that just to reflect back on something Karen said about stoops being an urban designation, because I really think of porches as being rural. And I've got a front porch in the house that I live in now, because I would say the Oakland I was born in was the westernmost part of the rural South. Lots of first generation Southern migrants came here in the 40s, like my grandparents did. And exactly like what June said, many of the stories were around the kitchen table. I was born in the house next door to where I live. And it was a three generation household for the first, few years of my life. And so, my grandma and her family, and it was a case of, I'm just listening. They're gossiping, they get their coffee, percolator. My grandma was from rural Louisiana. Her father spoke no English. He spoke that Creole stuff, which they didn't want me to understand what they were talking about. They'd switch into that. And as much as I wanted to learn that, it was not something that they taught me or thought there was much worth in it, because it was a shameful thing in her era to be from that rural background. And that language was forbidden in school. It was English only, and it was a mark of being country if you could speak that. My grandfather, on the other hand, his stories with him were in the garden. He grew everything. And so, I'll be out there working with him and he'd be, boy, blah, 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 blah. And hearing stories from him and about things. And then when him and his brothers would come and visit and listen to them, tell stories about where and how they grew up.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask Dawn to jump in, since you're a Berkeley native.
Yeah.
How did you learn about your neighborhood?
That's a great question. Well, it's interesting. I was a latchkey kid. Maybe a lot of urban youth were latchkey kids. So when I think of where storytelling took place, I actually think of what extends beyond the stoop or porch to the street, the playground, on the block. We used to play kickball against our neighbor's garage or riding bikes. And I lived in what then was called South Berkeley. I don't know if we still call it South Berkeley. So I just lived one block south of San Pablo Park. And so storytelling for me was amongst my peers. And so, it sometimes was ribbing and the dozens, and sometimes felt a little bit like bullying too, but it's where you learn like the language of the neighborhood. Some of those relationships I've maintained my whole life. And I had shared with you, Susan, before that, I didn't realize that I was bused. Because like I said, I lived there in South Berkeley, the flats, but I went to Oxford Elementary School, which is up in the hills. And so the school bus came and picked us up right there, kitty corner to my house, and we went to Oxford. But Berkeley, because of zoning, is so complicated. I remember when we were going then to junior high, and somebody that lived just a block over, we couldn't go to the same junior high. And that confused me and was so sad about it. But because Berkeley only has one public high school, we all reconverge. And so it's interesting sort of growing up in the hood. I had alliances with people that then I didn't continue to go to school with until we came back to high school together. And I was kind of a nerd and I got picked on a lot. But like my homies from the block had my back. So it's really interesting to think about how I understood zoning and displacement and things like that in Berkeley. And just apropos of nothing, my parents bought the house we had in Berkeley for $65K in 1983. That same house, which we no longer own, is worth $1.25 million. The very same home. So I know my parents are like, why did we give up that house? So yeah, thanks for asking, Susan.
Yeah. So there's playgrounds and gardens and porches and verandas, which are all part of, larger structures, right? That Karen was talking about. But Carolyn, CJ, tell us about where knowledge got passed down in the neighborhood where you grew up.
Yeah, I think certainly similar to what many folks have talked about, the kitchen was where knowledge was shared between the grown folks. And so the kids were sent outside, and the house I grew up on actually had a front porch, and so we were very close to East 14th Street. So everybody had to walk past our house to go to the corner store. And so we talked to lots of folks, saw lots of things, had conversations, played with folks on the front porch. Certainly, I'm also a minister's daughter. And so at church, there was certainly lots of knowledge passed, whether it be in the sermon, in the Bible studies, in the conversations before and after service, and the dinners that happened afterwards. The church where I first started was really very close, like a family. We literally were always in church. And so lots of that happened in the church. I think another place where stories were exchanged were definitely the school environments, the learning environments, the recreational facilities. Arroyo Viejo was my recreational facility. And yeah, walking over there, you kind of collect friends along the way, wherever they live, you get there and then you collect friends going backwards. So that's definitely a place where knowledge was sort of exchanged and learned. But the porch was a lot of fun. At East Oakland, when I grew up, there weren't gates and fences like you see now. So people would come by and ask for some water from your hose or just sit and talk. Or, I grew up in a place where at the time where folks would actually sing on the corner or come and sing out in front of your house for no reason, which was exciting. And it was something I was used to. So then you go out and talk to them and understand what their story is and just kind of trade and exchange and update. So those are the ways that information and knowledge was shared where I grew up in East Oakland.
Yeah, good stuff. So, to link, these places where stories happen, I'm curious about what kind of knowledge was passed down. And I remember, Dave, when we were walking around your neighborhood, you were talking about what you knew about. Can you hear us, Dave? Yeah.
I can't.
You can. Okay, good. About mortgages, right? You told some like individual stories about interest rates in that neighborhood, and which relates to the maps and to the things that Karen was showing us at the beginning. And about what kind of credit was available and what interest rates, applied on your street versus other streets.
I'm sorry.
So I was asking about the availability of credit, which you were telling us on the tour that you saw this firsthand. You weren't looking at it necessarily on a map, but it was like this was the everyday life of people trying to buy a house.
Yeah. So let me get to that by way of addressing something that Don said, because we moved from here to Ashby in San Paulo. And I got bused from that bus stop right across the street from San Paulo Park up to Hillside, 1970. And so these patterns were the same, right? And so, it's in 83, things had not changed. So very similar stories. Probably the most consistent storyteller was my uncle. He tells stories now. And the dude is probably the best storyteller I've been around. He's fortunate enough to continue to live next door to him. And so stories were always in the air, but to talk about, credit. And so these restrictions on the access to capital in certain ways made property available to Black folks in these neighborhoods as white folks were, and I'm gonna, use a term from Self, who points out that it's not necessarily white flight, it's white incentive to move to the suburbs. And so when the Bazzano family, who used to live in the house I live in now, were incentivized to move out to San Lorenzo, this neighborhood was redlined. There was not going to be bank mortgages available. And so who did he turn to? Turned to my grandfather, who lived next door, and carried the note. And he was able to buy this house for, I want to say something like $12,000 back in 1950. And then this became the house for my uncle, who raised his kids and grew up. And this house has a front porch. And so at some point, they installed a swing on it and come and sit on the swing, and he knew everybody. And then we talked to everybody that went around. But that story about grandfather acquiring the house, as that kid at the front porch, at the kitchen table, and I kind of being quiet so I could stay around the grown folk who were telling stories. It was never that explicit to me. Until I read Color of Law, whose subtitle is A Forgotten History. And I read that and it just zeroed in. I was like, I heard this story at the kitchen table, my grandmother's kitchen table, talking about the story of how we came here and how, my grandfather came to acquire these properties that are still here now. And it just really zeroed into me that this is known. This was known in this community, but it really wasn't until it was formalized by this professor that it became known and accepted to the rest of America. And so, these stories that Black folks tell each other that have this wisdom and this knowledge and this truth and this power very frequently are not accepted by the rest of the world until it was, legitimized by white academia. And so that serves an important purpose because it's very persuasive to a lot of folk that I've been yelling at, discussing with, telling stories to for a really long time, who now that is in an approved format, in an approved book, are now can agree that it really did happen.
June or CJ, do you have any thoughts about how the connection between, people's experiences on the ground and, academia and things getting into the media? How have you had the same experience that Dave's talking about?
I've read the book too, The Color of Law, and I was angry, and I could only read a chapter at a time because it helped me really, the same as Dave, understand what was happening. I remember my parents every weekend, trying to move out. They were trying to go to the nice places in Union City or Alameda, and we would come across things like the door to the rental office or the sales office being closed and it just was open. And I couldn't understand why sometimes I would see my mom and dad really being concerned about the mortgage or needing to refinance. And I realized that they had entered into an agreement with the previous owner. We bought from the last white person on the block, and they had an arrangement that wasn't very healthy. And I just began to recognize that my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, they told stories as well. They did not tell us what was going on. They kept those things to themselves. I couldn't understand sometimes, and they would shoo it away because they didn't want to talk about it. And they moved here in hopes that where they fled and what they were going through would pave the way for a better life, where their kids would not have to deal with what they were dealing with. And I think when I would see my father really frustrated or my mother shedding tears because there was another mortgage application denied or another place that wouldn't allow us to move there or something that happened, I didn't necessarily understand it was because we were Black, but when I read The Color of Law, it all made sense to me. And I was like, that's what was going on. And I was able to have conversations later with my mom, who's still living, and other folks about telling her that. And she, it was just something that they accepted. It was better than where they left, and they had hope for a better future. So they just created a very rosy picture. I never even saw East Oakland as a ghetto, quote unquote, but it was the third place that my families had been displaced from. They came to West Oakland, they were displaced. They came to Bayview, Hunters Point, they were displaced, and they all went to a place called Russell City, where again, they were displaced and then moved to East Oakland, where they couldn't buy a house on the other side of the tracks. I remember my father, my mother would go on these car rides and go try to buy something and just being denied. And so I think our parents kept things from us, and I think they knew. I appreciate the book for sharing the truth. And I think there's way more out there that we need to uncover and expose and really just talk about with each other.
CJ, I shared with you that I also live in what is now called the Eastmont district. It was not called that. I mean, the mall was there, Eastmont Mall, but it wasn't called the Eastmont district. And I live right off of MacArthur, and there's all these cement road blockades going in, I think, to stop the sideshows. And so I think there's really an interesting conversation that is continuing to happen about East Oakland and displacement. I know Google is buying up properties there for their employees. And so we start to wonder, my family, how long we'll be able to hang on to the house we have there, which is what's so thrilling for me to drive by and see Liberation Park and see the Acoma Market and know that corner there is having cultural activity take place, safe. I think we also have such a bad reputation for being a site of a lot of violence. I think what people, and it's not that it's not true, but it's also a residential neighborhood. I walk through the neighborhood. I say hello to my neighbors. They greet me. They look out for me. Yes, there's a lot of people in front of the corner store. Those are nice guys. I don't know how they earn a living, but they're nice guys. When I talk to them, they're cool people. I'm sorry, June, I think you had an impulse to speak. I'll hand it back to you.
It's so great to hear these stories, and because I'm a foreigner, but I want to give a little bit more context, because the three of us, CJ, Dael, and myself, all have economic backgrounds. CJ from real estate, David from accounting, and I used to be an economist. And I was raised and my dad was an accountant. And I put all this together. My core subject in high school was history. And as an architect, as I'm going through the city, I have not read The Color of Law for several reasons. One is I've already been looking at this stuff ever since I've started architecture. You walk the landscape and you can see the lines clearly. You have to be blind to not recognize that there was some legal structure that was put in place that allows one area to be radically different from another area, where you can walk a block and only see one tree and go a few blocks over and see 5, 10, 20. This is not because the trees decided by themselves to put themselves on a block in one location, and this one lonely tree decided it was going to exist in this other location. You have to be very open-minded and just be willing to see what's directly in front of you to want to take a further look, a deeper look. And that was what I did. Was when I started the practice in North Oakland, was I was truly interested in why does the landscape vary so radically different? And so I looked at maps. And so when I met Altanir and I met David and I saw all these photographs, and for me, my interest in these neighborhoods and these communities are less about the ordinances and the zonings and the ethnographic approach, but rather I'm far more interested in the celebration of the families and the celebration of the relationships and the celebration of the networks that are deep in these communities. When CJ talks about people coming up and sharing a hose, that's not something you're gonna find in a book or on a map. That's only something you're gonna learn by talking to a CJ who lived through it. And then my job as an architect is I'm looking for all those other moments of social interaction to be able to like celebrate them and bring them forward, because it's so easy to look at our neighborhoods and assume that there is no celebration worthy there. And I'm really glad that David's doing the tour and we can talk about porch stories, but I am far more interested in monumentalizing some of these deeply rooted cultural treasures that I think are just worthy of marking on the landscape. So I listened to it from that end, from the idea of celebration.
I want to agree with CJ. You know, reading Color of Law was infuriating, was enraged, was also trauma, you know, words will be heartbroken, you know, just ripped apart at the monumental size of that crime. And the fact that that crime and that debt is still owed today. And as the good doctor shared at the beginning, you know, that redlining map continues to map all sorts of differences across all kinds of social metrics today. You know, health, wealth, income, employment, just all kinds of factors. And to realize that this was a funded, a purposeful policy of all levels of our government, you know, federal, state, county, municipal, citing these things is such an obvious crime. I can't quite understand why we haven't had municipal reparations today, particularly, you know, in a so-called progressive area. What? It's don't get me started. Let me be quiet.
Well, Dave, you know, and I agree. I think that a part of the book and these conversations and people doing their study on what actually happened, not just here, but before here, you know, from the taking of this land, when no one, those land acknowledgements are not just something to do that's cute and popular. We're acknowledging that this land that we all sit on, that we trade in, that we develop on, belongs to the indigenous people of this land. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this country was built with stolen or exploited bodies, which were primarily African-American, but certainly other cultures. And with freedom came the opportunity to progress. And you see how our towns were burned and bombed, our attempts at economic development. We left the South. My great-grandfather left the South, fleeing the South from Jim Crow, and came here to this place that continued to do what is outlined in the Color of Law. And so one of the things that everybody has to acknowledge or not acknowledge, but there is a truth that cannot be denied. And that truth has to be reconciled with another community who just doesn't have this perspective. I mean, I have friends who are just, their lives just weren't like this. They didn't know. They see the images. And one of the things I like about what June said and what we are trying to do, Liberation Park, and what you're doing is to make this one-dimensional picture of this story that is this country, this story of who we are as Black people, to be multidimensional. So we celebrate despite. We enjoy and we bring joy. We invite you in, but we invite you in now to come and hear the truth and to reconcile the truth. And then to have the conversation about what does reparations looks like, from the beginning, indigenous people, to where we are now.
And I think, that's it, is, the acknowledgement without an attempt, because, you can't, that crime of the initial theft of this land can never be made right. We can make a reparative attempt, we can do something toward amends, but it can't be made right. And so to hear the acknowledgements and that recognition, I think, is the first step toward some sort of action that must happen. We know about the SHUMI, the land tax, that can be paid and should be paid. And we need to move towards doing that. And it just feels though it's so insignificant. Some sort of monetary settlement to the Native American community, but it's what we have and it's what we can do. And I'm a big believer in let's do what we can, and not be, wait for what's perfect.
And Dave, not everybody may be familiar with the notion of municipal reparations. When people hear the word reparations, they may think about older history and slavery, but we're talking about something that's very, very recent crimes and inequities, and very local. So can you talk a little bit more about that and what that discussion is about?
Yeah, I'll bring in one of the other panelists to maybe wants to jump on. I feel like I've been talking a lot. What do you want to do, June?
Go ahead. Go ahead. I give a perspective on it, and then maybe you can give a definition, because reparations can be framed in several ways. For example, one of my favorites is how the public government contracts projects. I am really, really heartened at that the general plan contract that the city of Oakland did an RFP for, asked for 50% community based organization participation. That for me was a signal of a turn, because in the past we've seen public contracts that call for 10%, 30%, or no acknowledgement of any kind of attempt to level out the voices at the table. And one part of reparations also is changing how government contracts, because that's gazillions of dollars. Even little Oakland does have a purse. And it's a purse where lots of our funds and our community benefit agreements are decided behind closed doors, or not enough people are at the table forming that agreement. Part of reparations is also who is at the table designing the future, not trying to incrementally increase the amount of people at the table. You have to decide that something ends and something new starts, because we've done the trickle-down economics and it hasn't worked. The other part I want to point out is reparations in the term of how we think about urban planning in general. Most times we hear our cities talk about the downtown and only the downtown. We need to start talking about neighborhood plans, completely planning our entire cities. The fact that the majority of our planning department's time is with developers who wish to develop in a downtown means that the general population is not getting their time from the planning department. That's inequity. A form of reparations is starting to track those hours that we dedicate to specific particular groups and start to level out how work is done within our own government, because it all started there. So that's just my perspective from the architecture and planning side. I'm going to hand it over to David to talk about the bigger picture.
Well, I tend to be kind of hyper local really these days. I can't really affect kind of big things. But what I can do is be a really strong advocate for the place that I live. But I guess to answer your question directly, we saw recently in a couple of years, and the one that comes to mind most directly, as I want to say Evanston, Illinois, who drafted a plan that said, if you lived in Evanston in a formerly red line area, the city's going to give you X, some call it token amount, some 20, 50, I don't know, $1,000, $100,000, whatever the amount is, towards it's basically down payment assistance. And so again, highly imperfect, and I understand that now that plan is been fraught with controversy. Some significant part of which is from the folks that is supposed to benefit, but that, for me, there are some kernels of really good ideas there. One is this fact that we're trying to repair our communities. I think a lot of times when we talk about reparations, the first thing some people say is, how much money do we got to give you, and what's it going to look like? And yeah. Which is kind of, for me, is a way to avoid the question. Let's first agree that this is just. And we can, once we can agree on that, we can figure out the specifics. Because I don't think there's a single solution. Monetary payments, it's really, though, for me, it's about beginning to recreate whole and healthy communities that communities can control. And, I think there was a city in North Carolina that did the same. I saw another one recently. Why don't we have that here? And so, I'm creative. I come up with wild ideas. I come up with things. I'm advocating for a plan that really mimics redevelopment. Why don't we, every time we have a new development, we set up a tax increment financing district, take some X percentage of that, and say those future revenues are going to be into an ability for the community to control and define how that's going to be spent, to kind of return, to the community an opportunity to redirect and invest some of these funds. Again, highly imperfect, but it's an idea. And so I think there's something that we can begin to demand, that our own municipality who says that they support these things can start to put their money where their mouth is.
Go ahead, CJ, because you.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, Dave, because I at the end of the day feel like, money follow the money. And when you look at the city budget and you see where the money goes, and a big portion of the money, as we all know, goes to fund the police department. And we, in East Oakland, we have an interesting history with the police department. I mean, if you, there was recruitment from the South to bring police officers to California to follow the Blacks that were fleeing so that they would never feel really free. And there's a whole history. My grandfather was also a sheriff. And so I don't have a dislike for the police department per se, but we have to acknowledge that the way the money is being used continues to support tools of suppression that were used historically. The police department, for example, started out as a slave patrol. And so what is hardwired into the police department is this noticing of Black people and that they're out of place and that they should be controlled and handled. But at the end of the day, all of these ideas are great, but when it comes down to it, where does the money go? Even when you set aside money for set-asides for contracts, I've seen, we're working on a big project in East Oakland, and one of the largest projects that we have is a construction project, and the firm that's doing the work, they're not based in Oakland. And I have friends who worked in the construction industry, and although you do hire first, many times it's not really folks from Oakland. And so millions and billions and trillions of dollars, even hard-earned dollars that the community has fought for to get here. And when you follow the money, the city did its own analysis of itself, and it rated itself a high F in terms of where the money goes. And so it's great to talk about reparations, but we may have to just rip the Band-Aid off and really go overarchingly the other way to really support and elevate. But this is decades of disinvestment, decades of poor education, decades of games and tricks, decades of it, where there's classes and groups and whole families who've just not been even as fortunate as my family, because I also have privilege. I happen to be born into a family and they were able to buy a home and keep a home. That's privilege. So everyone who has privilege needs to acknowledge that it's luck of birth, unearned privilege. And I think one of the things when people talk about reparations and, how much money is it going to take? My family didn't own slaves. Everybody who lives here, everybody who comes here, who immigrates here, whose family did, have to acknowledge that whatever your family left from, the country they left, they ran from, they fled, you came to a country that was suppressing people. And the reason it's so beautiful and bountiful is that it's exploitative. And, it's beautiful to be here and glad you have the opportunity. But if you don't start acknowledging the truth, doesn't mean you did anything, but acknowledge that you have this privilege of being in this place and coming here again, built on stolen land, built by stolen bodies, and continue to exploit people. So I'm going to stop there.
So, we've been talking both about future actions and also looking back to remedy some of the things that happened in the past. And I think Karen might have something to say about reparations and what that might look like, and how would we calculate that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on, because I couldn't agree more with what Dave said and what CJ said about reparations. I think there's a danger as soon as we start thinking about reparations in terms of cash. This is it, you get capital, right? But then what about human capital? And what about social capital? And what about political capital? And if you don't have all of those baked into the concept, you're going to be back to square one pretty quickly, right? And and so it's really then, and I really thought it was moving that everybody's reaction to Color of Law. That was such a life-changing book for so many of us, and really resonated. When you think about that Color of Law, that's still there. That whole system of regulations, that's still there. So you don't move the needle until you change that system. So one of the things that my students and I were thinking about when we looked at Berkeley zoning in that project, we started to say, what would a people-centered zoning look like? What if we zoned for people? What if we zoned for stories instead of zoning against stories, like zoning Dawn away from her friends into another school, right? What if we found a way to use those regulations to support those stories?
I think what Karen, what you said, I want to just repeat that. If you give people a payment in the current system, the system will operate to return it back to the people that gave it to you. And so, CJ, when folks say, I never owned no slaves, I didn't do it. This is not about individual action. This is systemic. This is systemic. This is not about an individual action. This is about the government. This is not a debt that I'm trying to say any individual owns. This is owed because our federal government, under its constitution, did unconstitutional things to transfer wealth to the suburbs and centralize poverty in urban areas, through all these policies, that you've talked about. And so I think once we understand that this is a system and a structure in a metropolitan area, and that the way this operates with, that through racism without racists, that this system just continues to operate because it was set up, this way and set in motion, and that this systems of privilege and disadvantage we're left unchecked unless we take some kind of radical action and change it, will continue to operate the way it was set up and meant to operate.
But Dave, I don't see it as just a federal. It doesn't stop just at the federal government, because it happens at every level of government. The federal government, yes, it has its share of responsibility, but we see it play out time and time again in every local government in how the budget is approved, what goes in the budget and what's not accounted in the budget, but later we end up having to pay for every year. Across the board, there's a huge responsibility at the administration level, both federal, county level, state level, and our own local cities, that we all share a part in this. And another reason why I point that out is, we know Alteneer has this letter from the woman who used to run the library from the 1935, where just with that one letter, she started the decline of Hoover Foster, when she said, we will not release the spaces for the libraries because this is not a reading community. This is 1935. So it's not just the federal government, there are local administration decisions that impact what we see on the ground play, and they all share a part of the blame, every last one of them. When they changed the zoning in Hoover Foster, that started the expansion of the warehouses and the industrial facilities, that too is part of the sharing of the responsibility. Zoning, particularly the planning department and transportation, these are the two that for me, I have the most ire, the most.
I'm going to give
what they do with the landscape.
Explain to everyone what June was just talking about, which is the Hoover Durant Library in a neighborhood of West Oakland, which was shut down, and which Dave and many others, including Alternier Cook, have been working for a long time to reestablish, because it was because of racism that June described that the library was shut down. But the
two libraries,
but the movement and the community coming together around this idea of a library, both the importance of an actual library, but also as a rallying point, has been really important in that neighborhood. And I think that also brings us to the question of the importance of stories and having that story known. That's what our summer course in Future Histories Lab was working with Alternier and other folks at Hoover Durant Library to create oral history so that people know the history of that neighborhood and how that happened. I don't know if any.
I would love to share the video that that David sent in on the Black Liberation Walking Tour and its connection to trying to reestablish a public library. Let me see if I can pull that up.
Delilah Beasley holds the distinction that she was the first African-American columnist whose writing was regularly featured in a nationally syndicated newspaper. In 1915, 1920, 25, they weren't teaching African-American history, so it was really important for her.
The party had been looking for a place to meet because every other place where they had met, they were being harassed by the police. So I told them they could meet at St. Augustine's. And then a very catalytic thing happened. After the service, members of the party and members of the congregation just stayed around and started talking to each other.
It was Dorch's Bank, and that's who owned the mortgage, and they told us we didn't have no rights because all the people had passed away. I said, nah, but from learning, from going to different organizations and doing different things, they taught me certain things about what to do if this situation came. Basically just said, hey, Annette, you don't have to leave.
I feel like it's great with this Black Liberation Walking Tour to really just be the visual depiction or even the eye candy of the tour. So, you have the historical sites, you have the houses, like you need some fresh paint, you need some murals that actually depict the story of the Hoover Foster community.
So Dave, do you want to tell folks how to take this tour and engage with some of the stories that were in that video?
Yeah, sure. First, I just want to, I'm so humbled and honored by the team that did that, to put that together, actually did the work. It was certainly my vision and ideas and coordinating that, but it's just such, I get chills. It's so phenomenal thinking about that. And so these are folks, so I would, posit to you that, this neighborhood, this Hoover Foster neighborhood, which in, 1936 would have been an aspirational neighborhood for Black folks to live in, because we had been confined on the other side of San Pablo, but yet the mere threat of Black folks getting close. And this was a white ethnic Portuguese and Italian neighborhood who were also undesirables, in purposes of this redlining map. And when the idea then began to take away that. But those stories from folks, and are a combination of, primarily, Ms. Cook, who is a contemporary of my mom. We went to Mac together back in the day, is really holding place here and knows everybody. And, you get to, I listen to her and, my mom and my uncle and Ms. Wells sit in my living room with just like 15 other people from the neighborhood who were here to talk about an election and stuff. And that was over. And they got to spinning tales about this neighborhood in the 50s. And I just watched like this hush come over this crowd. And that just kind of started, the idea of we need to capture these stories. And so, Delilah Beasley, who was capturing stories in 1915 about Black folks who pioneered the US, C.O. Dellums, who drove big Cadillacs and smoked long cigars, lived down the block here for 30, 40 years. And who's in that house today is still referred to by folks who've been around here long enough as the Dellums house. And so I would say his oral history is transcribed in Cal's archives. Go get it. Read just the very first part about him getting off the train from Texas in 1921 and kind of what he did before he became known. It's just riveting, just the courage. It's so inspiring. But the person that I really, for me, I lived away from Oakland for about 20 years. Work took me away. I remember reading in the paper Annette Miller's story, who said, Deutsche Bank, you can't have my grandfather's house. You can't have it. I'm not going to let you take it. And I said, you know what? That's the spirit of the neighborhood that I grew up in. I got to go find her. And so we moved back home. I went to set about finding Annette. So I wanted to hear her story, And so that story, that grit, that ability to demand recognition of who she is and who her family is and who we are, and to hold space and place under the whole weight of a system designed to take that property, that wealth, that ownership, that inheritance, those stories in that house away from her is so inspiring to me. And I have so much great admiration for her.
So if you want to hear more of these stories, you can go to blwt.org for the Black Liberation Walking Tour. And if there are going to be live tours coming up, they will be listed there, but you can download the audio tour anytime and take it. So I just want to let folks know that in the chat, people have been asking about how to connect with the tour. So that's it, or just Google Black Liberation Walking Tour. And
sorry, I get off topic sometimes.
No, that's great. I want to make sure that CJ has a chance to share what she's doing, the amazing work of the Acoma Market and the Black Cultural Zone. Your work is amazing in East Oakland, so tell us about it.
Sure, thank you so much. The Black Cultural Zone was really a concept that was developed by the East Side Arts Alliance in 2010 as they saw sort of the decimation of a presence of Black business along a major corridor, East 14th Street, renamed International. And that's an example of folks renaming stuff that we never asked you to. But the Black presence has gone from, 1,000 businesses along that corridor from end to 4 or 5. And, there was just a simple call. There needs to be a Black cultural zone that is here to hold place for Black people and Black businesses amidst the looming gentrification and displacement. And so what we do with the Black Cultural Zone, which is a community development corporation, it's a collaborative and it's a zone as well, is to look out for how do we center Black arts and culture as we anchor place and hold place keeping experiences and acquire and develop properties to anchor Black cultural zone hubs where there can be a collection of people that come together around building a strong Black economy, supporting our entrepreneurs, supporting our local Black folks, circulating the dollars within our community, because you cannot expand your community if all of your dollars leave. All of the dollars that are raised for by nonprofits go and pay other folks. You can't do that. And really improving the quality of life. As I said before, I've been here all my life. I was born in Highland Hospital, lived in Brookfield Village to Brandy Park, and my family, settled in the 80s off of East 14th Street. And just watching the decimation of the quality of life in East Oakland is shameful. The garbage, the dirt, the trash, the fencing, the security, all of those things were not always that way. The crack bomb hit, it changed our neighborhood. The foreclosure hit and the pandemic hit. We keep taking these hits. And what we're doing now is saying we're going to hold place. And so a couple of properties that we're looking at acquiring and holding. One is what we call Liberation Park. It's above Eastmont Mall, which was a central hub, again, and a sign of what is happening. It used to be a mall we would go to every weekend. You'd see people you knew, you got some food, you got some clothes for school.
Back to school shopping.
Back to school shopping, just normal stuff. And now it's a prison and a social services hub and nothing that can really help folks have jobs. My sister got her first job at Eastmont Mall. She worked at JCPenney's and took pictures. I mean, those opportunities are not there. So there is a vacant piece of land that was left and abandoned. And we've converted it into a cultural, commercial, and sort of community hub where we have outdoor farmers markets on the first and third Sundays. I'm here at Liberation Park now getting ready for a movie night. We're showing Summer of Soul. We're using a Black caterer. We're really supporting that. We installed Oakland's only outdoor roller skating rink because roller skating is a big part of our culture. That happens on first, third Sundays. It's a place where it shows what we can do if given an opportunity to really speak for ourselves and design what we need to have for ourselves. So that's what it is. And ultimately, we're here. I think there is a video that we can share that talks a little bit about the Black Cultural Zone. I don't know if that's available to show. So I'll let it speak.
I have the video right here. I'll pull that up. And as I do that, I'll encourage folks to start thinking about their questions and putting those in the chat.
It's the reason why we call it the hood, because we lost the neighbor aspect. East Oakland I grew up in, we know our neighbors. Cracking and the violence completely obliterated that trust.
Predatory lending hit East Oakland, foreclosures hit East Oakland. 70% of unhoused folks are Black people who lived really in East Oakland. I've seen the absolute systemic reduction of our ability to live.
But it's like all of a sudden Oakland became this place to be, and the rents began to double, triple, even quadruple.
I think everyone's fear is that it's going to lead to even more erasure of what has historically been Oakland.
Several years ago, my son Simarache made a mistake that cost him and me dearly. Discrimination was taking place on a lot of levels. So we felt it was a need to step up to the plate.
There's been a lot of victories, there's been a lot of wins. The entire city council agreed with us that this was an example of environmental racism.
We have a right to have a good existence, to have homes, to have peace, to have place.
When you raise up the issues of African Americans, you raised up the issues of all people.
We have to always consider the human element of any policy we are working on.
I had a meeting with the Berkeley City Council around the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance.
What would it look like to acquire land, to have a space and a place where people can live, where they can exist?
The community comes together and builds relationships and builds power. Like, that was the ultimate goal.
Oakland is not just an edgy slogan to wear on a t-shirt. For those of us who grew up here, it really means something.
When we work together, we can do all kinds of things.
It's gonna take us to save us. It's gonna take us to save us.
And I would encourage folks to go visit our site, blackculturalzone.org, blacklovethrives.com, and just visit us and learn more about what we're doing and come out and support us building a strong Black economy and holding place for Black people and Black business. And June Grant is one of our partners, original OG partner, and I'm just glad to have her here with us. I'd love to see what she has to say about the Black Cultural Zone.
Oh man, CJ, it's such an honor to watch and be a part of this amazing group, because when you look across Oakland or any city, there is Chinatown, we have Fruitvale, but we don't have any Africa towns. And so as an architect watching Seattle and Chicago and all these other cities start to establish their Africa town, it's just wonderful to be a part of Oakland's version, but also to just, instead of being in the leadership position, to be in the back supporting you guys, because you clearly know what you want to see. And in my opinion, it doesn't have to be designed. You guys know what you want and you kind of know how you want to do it. And so my job is to just support you to build your vision of how you'd like to see something and test it out. For me, the greatest joy is seeing someone exercise their creativity. I'm not there to evaluate design. I'm there to empower you to exercise your creative potential. And then we see where it goes, because, you know, we all very, very creative and we always changing things on the fly. So I love seeing how the Black Culture Zone has gone from what we had like 6 stalls in the big old park. And now there's a roller skating rink and there's so many stalls, there's barely any space. And there are the movies at night. And it's just absolutely wonderful. Like even my husband says, are we going to the market? Even when I'm not thinking about it, he's going, are we going? So I'm just honored to be part of not just your effort, but also David's and Altair, because you know, Altair Baker Cook is a force of her own. And it's just been just an amazing honor to support both communities.
Yeah, you know, CJ, you know how inspiring your work is to me. You know, me and some of my neighbors have formed the West Oakland Cultural Action Network, because we're like, you know, still Black people in West Oakland. We're trying to preserve our culture too, right? We're trying to hold space. We're trying to get some of this commercial property. You know, this is what this BOWT is about, is documenting the fact that we are still here and acknowledging that we are here because there's people here before us who did this pioneering work, because it's just what we have always had to do. You know, we just take it up because just, you know, this is what we have to do. You know, I want to react to one thing you said, June, about the industrial sites in this neighborhood. And I think about that as I walk around here a lot. And, you know, growing up here in the you know, late 60s, early 70s, beginnings of my memory, and remembering, you know, the bakery that we used to go to when we left Durant and get the leftover donuts, and realizing, you know, that the laundry, you know, not the dry cleaning commercial kind, but that provided employment in this neighborhood for folks. And that employment provided economic support for little restaurants and shopkeepers and liquor stores. And so I'm just thinking about the facts, kind of this mixed economy, this mixed zoning, while it's not suburbia. And many people find it undesirable. And we are still suffering from the toxic effects of some of the really truly industrial sites here. But in some ways, I think that's a viable model for self-sustaining communities that you don't have to, you know, travel places to. So, you know, my you know, talking about Africa Town, my goal is I want to be able to walk to everything I want to get to, you know. And fortunately, and this is an old part of town, you know, at one point, you know, West Oakland was a city within a city. And at one point, this was not even West Oakland. You know, Cook reminds us all of that all the time, right? And so how, you know, and so that's just a value of mine. I kind of, if I got to get in my car, I kind of don't want it. But that's, for me, that's kind of my nirvana, is to have that sort of community. And because I'm not old enough to really understand how some of the negatives of it was then, but I vividly know in watching this neighborhood decline during the 70s, during the industrialization, seeing San Pablo Boulevard turned from kind of a retail and small industrial and commercial site space to a lot of abandoned storefronts now. It breaks my heart. And when I look at the recent census results and see Black folks continue to decline, every other group increases, it breaks my heart some more. So what are we gonna do? And I look to, we're gonna, you know, I'm trying to copy Black. Hitch my wagon to the Black Cultural Zone. Let's do it.
Our wagon's hitched to yours. West Oakland is our genesis. I always say that. It's the legacy community. And one of the things I like about this conversation is the stories that we're telling each other now. I think what we've seen Obama was an unrealistic dream. Having a Black president was not anything anybody Black thought was ever possible. It's like, that's never going to happen. And it did. And then, with that hope, it was dashed with sort of the newer recent administration and their approach towards anybody that wasn't white. It felt like. And I think it's opened all of our eyes, and what happened with the pandemic and George Floyd and awareness. I think we are all having these conversations now in virtual stoops and virtual front porches, and organizing to say, okay, it's for us to do this together. And so I'm hitching our wagon to you all in West Oakland, because we believe that you West Oakland folks deserve place. And again, our origin story for most Black folks here is West Oakland.
I'm so grateful to have been part of this conversation, and I know that the audience has some questions. And so I invite everyone in the audience, if you do have any questions, please type them in the chat or a comment. We'd love to hear from you. I know that you may have questions for our panelists.
Rita writes, I've been in Oakland for 75 years. My husband's 77. I grew up in Jingletown, and his homes changed because his family grew to 12. So they had to move to homes big enough for the crew. We share our experiences with each other and our children, who share them with their children. We are both fifth generation Oaklanders. I love learning more and more about our beautiful city. Thank you, Rita, so much for sharing that. If folks also want to, turn on their mic and take the mic, or use their little digital hand to make it pop up on my screen, you have a lot of opportunities to drop things in here. And Susan, you also dropped in the chat that for more conversations like this, check out futurehistories.berkeley.edu. Susan, do you want to say anything more about Future Histories Lab and your speaker series?
Yeah, sure. We are really excited to have a speaker series on Mondays at 11. It's on place-based storytelling, techniques and technologies. And we're going to be bringing together folks, including Dave Peters, but others who have created not just walking tours, but archives, augmented reality projects, podcasts, all as ways of using storytelling as activism. And this is what we are teaching our own students to do, to experiment both with the traditions of, telling stories in the garden and on the porch, and combining those with virtual reality and augmented reality. So that's what we're working on. And we have a great raft of summer courses. Those are open to enrollment by the public as well. This is what we're working on at UC Berkeley, is figuring out more ways of telling and sharing these stories in order to bring about change. And I invite everyone to our Future Histories Lab open house on Wednesday, August 25th, outdoors, as safe as we can make it, at 5:30 p.m. at Worcester Hall. You can find information on that also at futurehistories.berkeley.edu. We are constantly building relationships with great community partners like the Black Cultural Zone and the Black Liberation Walking Tour and the Hoover Durant folks. And I just want to invite everybody to join us.
I see Regina Evans has her hand up. Regina is also another storyteller in our community doing remarkable things, including doing the costumes for Stoop Stories, which is on our stage soon. So Regina, please speak.
Yes. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Carolyn, because we just had like a huge outreach. I do work with kids that are trafficked, and we do it on international. And we were able to get like funding from you all to do our outreach. We did our biggest outreach to these kids with the help of the funding, and what's come out of that is that we're getting ready to do a push on the track. Somebody was talking about the infrastructure of trees. We're getting ready to do a push to get trees on the track to beautify that area. But so just wanted to say thank you for that help. But so I'm from Oakland. My dad was from Oakland, from West Oakland. And my mom came here from Mobile when she was 14. I know that their grouping of friends moves silently, but they have some amazing stories. And I'm wondering, like, how do we engage like these elders who are literally sitting on gold in terms of how we mine like elder and also ancestral wisdom for how we should move. Like when you think about West Oakland, when I think about West Oakland, I think about Dorothy Pitts. And Oakland doesn't talk enough about Dorothy Pitts. Dorothy Pitts was West Oakland. Like everybody like that I know from like my parents' friends, they all went through DeFermery Park under her care. And she was no joke. And she also went on after DeFermery, she actually built housing for elders. It's still there. And I think she built like she was involved in building three different buildings. And so I'm wondering how like that history is being engaged, and how like our elders who moved quietly because they had to, you know, how are we trying to access them? Like I'm writing my mom's history, and but I'm just wondering, and like I pass on her wisdom to the young people that I'm in community with. But I'm just wondering, you know, because they're like in their late 80s, 90s now. How do we capture that? Because there's a lot of them. And I know my family story is like insane, like crazy, because my mom is a beautiful beast. She was not playing with people. She did not play. And as a matter of fact, because of what my parents did, my parents bought apartments, like fourplexes, like all throughout Oakland. They keep their rent super low, but they bought these way back in the day. It's how I'm able to do my work. It's how I'm able to help support young girls that are being trafficked. It has flowed. That's how that money has flown down. So anyway, I'm just curious as to the quiet elders.
I'd like to jump in.
Listening is so important. And you know, and so much of it and that recording is going on in community, but we are also at Future Histories Lab, it's our job to train the young people to listen and record and share. And so especially, you know, young people from these neighborhoods who are the grandkids of these folks. So I invite anyone who has stories or elders who need to be listened to. That's what we're here for. So you can contact me, and you know, I'll try to connect you with existing oral history projects in the neighborhoods, and also with our students who are eager to listen.
But in what neighborhoods? Because are you guys hitting up the hills as well? Because a lot of these people moved to the hills. That's what they were quiet about. And that history is being lost.
Yeah, so we need
they moved quietly from one hill to the next. And now they're moving out of Oakland.
Right.
And it's like I see it happen. And like histories like Eichler, do we even know like Eichler or Frank Williams, who was the first Black man that Eichler sold to, who was head of the NAACP. And then that opened up a whole thing. Like Mr. Eichler and Mr. Williams just shifted like the whole story for housing. you know, in its own little bubble, and like those kind of histories. I'm just wondering, and it's quiet. That's what I'm concerned about, like the quiet history.
Yeah.
So I on that redlining map, the doctor showed us, if you look at that, there's a red line up in the East Oakland Hills. If that's the 1936 map. And I've always been curious about that, why that neighborhood, that particular neighborhood is redlined. So I can only speak for what we did with the BOWT. And so it took access to capital. You got a grant to go ask elders for their oral histories. And so we are building trust, and we ask each one to refer to somebody else and use that as an introduction. Many people have not wanted to talk. Many people have wanted to talk. And so, and the idea is, okay, we want to capture these, but then how do we make these accessible? Because, if we put it in a vault, what good is it? And that's why we're using this tour and website platform, because we want to digitize these, put it in the library's archives virtually until we get a building, and use it to build community and allow the community to access it.
I've brought Rafael Gonzalez on to join us, another storyteller in our community. Rafael, you had your hand raised.
Oh, thank you, Dawn. I just wanted to thank you all for speaking a just truth and for exploring it, and want to thank each and every one of you, because we make our revolution, and that's what it's all about. And we have to make it very soon, because just the circumstances push us to do it. And just thank you, and bless you all.
Thank you, Rafael.
Can I just say something in response to Regina's?
Of course.
And it was, Regina, this is not really, it's not an ad, it doesn't actually answer your question, but it's a story. I once had a client, a young couple, African-American, who I think either inherited the house, but it was way up in the hills up by Eastmont, like a part of Oakland I didn't know, but there are a lot of African-American families out there. And I'm telling this story because it's more architectural, because you mentioned Eichler. I walked in the house and they had built in surround sound system from the 70s. This is a house built by African-American contractor, owned by the same family. So they built their own house up on the hills, and it had built-in surround sound, and the record player was built into the wall, and it tipped down and it still worked. And they had also a door release for the front door. So you rang the doorbell outside, and they were inside on the second floor, and you pull the lever and it opened the front door. And this is a very simple house. We're not talking about some great mansion, but I tell the story about a building and a family that had a view about a future and how they wish to live in a house. This is not the part of the Black experience we talk about, which is also the very building that we have designed for ourselves. And it's typically not by some architect, but usually your builder did the drawings and they build the house. But I tell this because this house was built in the 70s by a Black family. And this is how they decided they wanted their lifestyle to be. And it's not your typical story that we hear, but I offer it as, this is an amazing jewel that I came across. And I hope to God that they still have the drawings for this house, because I thought it was just the most amazing experience to walk back in time to their grandparents and what their grandparents saw for themselves, and how this is part of Black history as well. A family that decided to design their own future and how their house, they wanted to live in their house. Can you imagine the 70s with surround sound? Record player built into the wall?
Amazing.
Really? It was wild. It was wild.
These are the stories that we all need to tell each other.
Exactly.
It's joy. It's not all woe.
Yeah,
it's joy.
It's joy as well.
And I want to say that I think
story.
I just want to say one thing that I think, to Regina's point, it takes an investment to specifically say we're going to preserve and archive and gather. And I think we need to reach out and connect on that issue. And I'm sorry, there's background noise here because they're out here having a good time, but we need to make a commitment with our Black-led organizations and other organizations that we want to find a way to preserve and archive these stories because they're important. My mom is 81 and she just, every time I talk to her, there's something new I'd never heard about her experience. And we got to find somebody who can interview, but we have to make the investment. It's an investment that we need to make.
I think my mom was in the audience. I have the same experience. She always has a story. I'm finding out new stuff now.
With profound gratitude and respect for your time, we are at past 6:30, so we should bring this to a close. Definitely we dropped some things in the chat, but I would love to give you each a final opportunity. If you have links or some announcements that you want to share, feel free to give voice to those. They're all in the chat. Perfect. Great. Well, I'll remind folks that are joining us both here in Zoom and through the stream that Stoop Stories starts performances September 3rd. That is a digital production. So you can buy a ticket and then watch it. You have a 36-hour window to watch it at your leisure. And it's directed by Elizabeth Carter. Regina Evans, who you heard from, has done the costumes. Janae Simon stars as 25 different roles. And again, it's written by Dael Orlandersmith. And we will have a series of post or pre-show conversations that will take place just like this in a Zoom meeting. And you can find all that information on our website, auroratheater.org. Thank you so much. We plan to do more Aurora Connects episodes, special episodes like this, where we invite folks to join us in the Zoom and be part of a conversation. So thank you all for coming, and gratitude to our speakers.
Thank you for inviting me.
CJ and Dave and June. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.